"Mom, we just don't think this trip is right for someone your age," my daughter Emily finally said, her voice dripping with that patronizing tone I'd grown to despise. "Hawaii has a lot of walking, and you know how you get tired easily." At 65, I wasn't exactly ready for a wheelchair, but apparently my own family had already written me off as too frail, too old, too much of a burden for their precious vacation. What happened next? Well, let's just say they learned that Sophia Brown still had a few tricks up her sleeve. Sometimes the best revenge is buying the very airline your ungrateful family planned to fly on. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I've always been the kind of woman who made things happen. When my husband Harold passed away 8 years ago, I didn't crumble like everyone expected. Instead, I picked myself up, dusted off my business degree that had been collecting dust for decades, and threw myself into managing our family's investment portfolio. What started as a necessity became a passion, and before I knew it, I had tripled our net worth through careful stock picks and strategic real estate investments. Our sprawling ranch house in Scottsdale, Arizona, with its terracotta tiles and desert landscaping that Harold and I had lovingly designed together, became my sanctuary and my headquarters. I converted his old office into a command center, complete with multiple monitors tracking market movements, financial news feeds, and investment opportunities. My days were filled with conference calls with brokers, analyzing quarterly reports, and making decisions that would have intimidated many people half my age. But despite my financial success, my 3 adult offspring had somehow gotten it into their heads that I was becoming a fragile old woman who needed their protection and guidance. Emily, my eldest at 42, worked as a marketing director for a tech company in San Francisco. She had inherited her father's cautious nature, but somehow twisted it into a condescending concern for my well-being. Then there was Michael, 39, a successful lawyer in Denver who had developed an annoying habit of speaking to me like I was one of his elderly clients who couldn't understand basic legal concepts. Finally, there was Sarah, my youngest at 36, a doctor in Phoenix who had started treating me like one of her geriatric patients, constantly asking about my medications and whether I was eating properly. The trouble began last winter when they started planning what they called a family reunion vacation to Hawaii. It had been Sarah's idea initially. She claimed we all needed to spend quality time together now that everyone was settled in their careers and the grandkids were old enough to appreciate travel. The plan was ambitious. 2 weeks in Maui, staying at a luxury resort, with activities planned for everyone from snorkeling to hiking to cultural tours. I was thrilled when Sarah first mentioned it during one of our monthly family video calls. "That sounds wonderful," I had said, already mentally planning my outfits and researching the best local restaurants. "I haven't been to Hawaii since your father and I went for our 25th anniversary." But as the months progressed and the planning became more detailed, I noticed something troubling. The conversations increasingly happened without me. Emily would text Michael about flight options. Sarah would call them both about hotel arrangements. When I asked about specific details, I was told they were still working things out, or that they'd update me soon. The exclusion wasn't dramatic or obvious. It was death by 1,000 small cuts. Comments about how I might find certain activities too strenuous. Suggestions that I might prefer to relax by the pool while they went on excursions. Discussions about whether the resort rooms had adequate accessibility features, as if I were suddenly using a walker. I had built a multi-million-dollar investment portfolio from scratch. I regularly attended board meetings where I was the only woman in the room and commanded respect from men decades younger than me. I traveled frequently for business, often to challenging locations. Yet somehow, in my own family's eyes, I had become a delicate flower who might wilt under the Hawaiian sun. The final straw came during a family dinner at my house 3 months before the planned trip. I had prepared Harold's famous barbecue recipe, something that required hours of preparation and careful timing. As we sat around the dining table on my back patio, watching the desert sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, Emily brought up the vacation. "We've been thinking about the Hawaii trip," she said, carefully avoiding my eyes. "And we're wondering if it might be better if you stayed home this time." I nearly choked on my wine. "I'm sorry, what?" Michael jumped in, his lawyer voice in full effect. "It's just that there's a lot of physical activity planned. Long walks on the beach, hiking trails, boat trips. We're concerned it might be too much for someone your age." "Someone my age?" I repeated, feeling my blood pressure rising. "I'm 65, not 95. Sarah, ever the doctor, leaned forward with her most professional expression. "Mom, we love you, but we've noticed you've been slowing down lately. Last month when we went shopping, you needed to sit down several times, and you mentioned your knees have been bothering you." I stared at my youngest daughter, remembering that shopping trip differently. Yes, I had sat down. On the benches they had specifically because I was carrying everyone's bags while they tried on clothes for 2 hours. And my knees bothered me after playing tennis 3 times a week, not because I was falling apart. "So, you're uninviting me from a family vacation because you think I'm too old to handle it?" I asked, my voice dangerously quiet. "We're not uninviting you," Emily said quickly. "We're just suggesting that maybe you'd be more comfortable staying home. You could use the time to relax, maybe have some spa days. We'll take lots of pictures and videos to share with you." The patronizing tone was the final insult. These were my offspring, people I had raised, supported through college, helped launch their careers. I had changed their diapers, nursed them through illnesses, celebrated their successes, and comforted them through failures. And now they were essentially patting me on the head and telling me to stay home like a good little old lady while they went off to have fun without me. "I see," I said, setting down my wine glass with deliberate precision. "And I suppose this decision has already been made? You've already booked everything, assuming I wouldn't be coming." The guilty expressions around the table told me everything I needed to know. They had indeed planned this entire vacation without me, then had the audacity to come to my house, eat my food, and tell me it was for my own good. "We just want what's best for you, Mom," Michael said, sounding exactly like the condescending attorney he had become. What was best for me, apparently, was to fade quietly into the background of my own family's life, to become the sweet old grandmother who stayed home and waited for photos and stories from the real participants in family adventures. As I looked around the table at these 3 successful adults whom I had raised to be independent and confident, I realized with crystal clarity that they no longer saw me as Sophia Brown, the woman who had built a fortune through intelligence and determination. They saw me as an aging burden to be managed and protected from my own supposed limitations. That night, after they left with their polite kisses on my cheek and promises to keep in touch about other ways to spend time together, I sat alone, on my patio, watching stars emerge in the clear desert sky, and made a decision that would change everything. If my family thought I was too old and frail for their Hawaiian adventure, I would show them exactly how much life this 65-year-old woman still had left in her. The morning after that humiliating dinner, I woke up with a clarity I hadn't felt in months. The Arizona sun was streaming through my bedroom windows, casting long shadows across the hardwood floors Harold and I had installed together 15 years ago. But instead of my usual routine of checking the financial markets over coffee, I found myself staring at the ceiling, replaying every condescending word from the night before. I had barely slept, my mind churning over the casual way my own offspring had dismissed me. The more I thought about it, the angrier I became. Not just hurt, furious. These were the same people who had called me crying when their marriages hit rough patches, asking for advice. The same ones who still asked me to review their investment, portfolios, and tax strategies. Michael had literally asked me for a loan to buy his Denver law practice just 3 years ago, which I had provided without hesitation. After a quick shower and my morning coffee, I did something I rarely did anymore. I called my sister Margaret in Tampa. Margaret was 2 years older than me, and unlike my offspring, she had never treated me like I was 1 foot in the grave. "Sophia," she answered on the second ring, her voice bright and energetic. "What a nice surprise. How are you, honey?" "I'm furious," I said without preamble, settling into my favorite chair on the back patio. The desert morning was crisp and beautiful, with a clear blue sky that stretched endlessly toward the mountains. "Oh no, what happened? Did one of the kids do something stupid again? Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Margaret had always been direct about my offspring's shortcomings. While other family members tiptoed around their feelings, my sister called things as she saw them. It's why I trusted her judgment more than almost anyone else's. I told her everything. The months of subtle exclusion from vacation planning, the dinner conversation, their patronizing concerns about my supposedly declining health. When I finished, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. "Those ungrateful little shits," Margaret finally said, her voice tight with anger. "Sophia, you're in better shape than most people 20 years younger. Didn't you just run a 5K last month for that charity event?" "I did more than run it. I placed 3rd in my age group," I reminded her. "But apparently that doesn't matter because I sat down during a shopping marathon." "This is ridiculous. What airline are they? Flying?" The question seemed random, but I had learned over the years that Margaret's mind worked in mysterious ways. "Pacific Coast Airways," I said. "Sarah found some package deal through them." "Pacific Coast Airways," Margaret repeated thoughtfully. "Isn't that the regional airline that's been struggling financially? I remember reading something about them in the Wall Street Journal." My interest was immediately piqued. As someone who made a living analyzing investment opportunities, the mention of a struggling airline caught my attention. "What kind of struggling?" "Cash flow problems, I think. High debt, aging fleet, competition from the major carriers. The kind of thing that makes companies ripe for acquisition or major investment." I felt something shift in my chest. The familiar thrill I got when I spotted a potential opportunity. "Margaret, you might be onto something." "What are you thinking, sis?" "I'm thinking maybe it's time I looked into Pacific Coast Airways a little more closely." After we hung up, I immediately fired up my computer and began researching. What I found was fascinating. Pacific Coast Airways was indeed in financial trouble, but not because they were a bad company. They had an excellent safety record, decent customer service ratings, and served some highly desirable routes along the West Coast, including the Phoenix to Maui route my family had booked. Their problems were largely due to poor financial management by their previous ownership group and some bad timing with aircraft leases. They were hemorrhaging money, but their core business model was sound. The kind of situation that made my investor instincts tingle with excitement. I spent the entire morning diving deep into their financial statements, SEC filings, and industry reports. By noon, I had a clear picture. Pacific Coast Airways was a diamond in the rough, undervalued, and mismanaged, but with tremendous potential in the right hands. That afternoon, I called my financial advisor, Robert Chen, whom I had worked with for the past 5 years. "Sophia?" he answered warmly. "How can I help you today? Looking at any new investment opportunities?" "Actually, yes. I want you to research Pacific Coast Airways for me. Everything you can find. Financial position, debt structure, ownership details, any merger or acquisition rumors. The regional airline? I think they're in some trouble financially. Are you thinking about airline stocks in general?" "I'm thinking about something much more specific, Robert. I want to know what it would take to acquire a controlling interest in the company." There was a pause. "Sophia, that's a significant undertaking. Acquiring an airline, even a small regional one, is incredibly complex. There are regulatory approvals, union negotiations, operational considerations. Robert, I interrupted gently but firmly. I didn't ask if it was complex. I asked what it would take. I've built a portfolio worth $12 million by not shying away from complex opportunities. Of course, you're absolutely right. Let me make some calls and get back to you with a preliminary analysis. This could take a few days to put together properly. I appreciate that, but I need preliminary information by tomorrow. Full analysis by the end of the week. After hanging up, I felt more energized than I had in months. My offspring thought I was too old and tired for a Hawaiian vacation. They were about to learn exactly how wrong they were. The next morning, Robert called with his initial findings. Pacific Coast Airways was indeed available, in a manner of speaking. The current ownership group was actively seeking investors or buyers. Their debt was manageable for someone with my liquid assets, and the regulatory hurdles, while complex, were not insurmountable. The rough estimate for a controlling stake would be somewhere between $8 and $10 million, Robert explained. That includes assuming their debt and providing working capital for operations. I felt my heart rate increase. It was a significant portion of my net worth, but not financially devastating. More importantly, it was exactly the kind of bold move that would send a very clear message to my family about their assumptions regarding my capabilities. Schedule a meeting with their representatives, I told Robert. I want to sit down with them as soon as possible. Sophia, are you sure about this? It's not just the money. Running an airline is a full-time commitment. It's incredibly demanding. I looked out at the desert landscape beyond my office windows, thinking about how everyone in my life seemed determined to limit my horizons. Robert, I've been looking for a new challenge. I think I just found it. That evening, as I sat on my patio with a glass of wine, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. The thrill of a major decision that was entirely my own. My family wanted to exclude me from their vacation because they thought I was too old and fragile. They were about to discover that this 65-year-old woman was just getting started. 3 days after my initial conversation with Robert, I was sitting in a sleek conference room on the 32nd floor of a downtown Phoenix high-rise, staring across a mahogany table at 3 men in expensive suits who clearly hadn't expected to be meeting with a 65-year-old woman about acquiring their airline. The meeting had been arranged quickly, too quickly for Pacific Coast Airways, executives to do their usual due diligence on potential investors. Robert had simply told them that his client was interested in discussing a significant investment opportunity, and they had jumped at the chance without asking many questions. Desperation, I had learned over the years, made people less careful about details. Mrs. Brown, said the man who had introduced himself as Thomas Martinez, Pacific Coast Airways' chief financial officer. We appreciate your interest in our company. However, I have to ask, do you have experience in the aviation industry? I smiled politely, the same smile I had perfected during decades of being underestimated in business meetings. Mr. Martinez, I have experience in recognizing undervalued assets and turning around struggling companies. Would you prefer to discuss my qualifications, or would you like to hear my preliminary offer? The 3 men exchanged glances. I could practically see them thinking, is this elderly woman serious, or are we wasting our time? Of course, Martinez said smoothly. We'd be very interested in hearing your thoughts. Based on my analysis of your financial statements and market position, I'm prepared to offer $9 million for a 60% controlling stake in Pacific Coast Airways, with an additional $3 million in working capital to be provided over the first year of operations. The silence that followed was deafening. I had clearly gotten their attention. James Johnson, who had introduced himself as the CEO, leaned forward. That's a very serious offer, Mrs. Brown. May I ask? What your timeline would be for this acquisition? I'd like to have preliminary agreements in place within 2 weeks, I said calmly. Full closing within 60 days, assuming regulatory approval. Martinez was frantically scribbling notes. Mrs. Brown, forgive me for asking, but do you have the liquid assets to support an offer of this magnitude? I reached into my briefcase and pulled out a portfolio summary that Robert had prepared. These are my current holdings. As you can see, the proposed investment represents approximately 70% of my liquid net worth, but well within my capacity. Johnson's eyebrows rose as he scanned the documents. This is quite impressive. You've built this portfolio yourself? Over the past 8 years, following my husband's death, I find that being underestimated in business negotiations is often an advantage. The meeting continued for another hour, with technical discussions about fleet maintenance, route optimization, and regulatory requirements. I had done my homework thoroughly, and it showed. By the time we concluded, the 3 executives were looking at me with a mixture of respect and bewilderment. As I drove home through the desert afternoon heat, I felt exhilarated. The deal was far from complete, but the groundwork was laid. More importantly, I had proven to myself that I was still capable of making bold, complex decisions that would have intimidated people half my age. That evening, I was reviewing route, maps, and financial projections when my phone rang. Emily's name appeared on the screen. "Hi, Mom," she said, her voice carrying that false brightness that meant she was about to ask for something. "How are you feeling? Better about the Hawaii situation? Actually, Emily, I'm feeling quite well. Energized, even." "That's great to hear. Listen, I wanted to talk to you about something else. Michael and Sarah and I were discussing it, and we think it might be time for you to consider moving into one of those nice senior communities. You know, somewhere with activities and people your own age." I felt my grip tighten on the phone. "Excuse me?" "It's just that we worry about you being alone in that big house. What if something happened? What if you fell or had some kind of emergency? There are some beautiful places in Scottsdale with golf courses and social activities. You'd probably make lots of friends." The patronizing tone was even worse over the phone. "Emily, I'm 65 years old, not 90. I'm in excellent health, I manage my own finances, and I certainly don't need to be warehoused in a retirement community. Mom, don't take it like that. We're just concerned. And honestly, that house is probably too much for you to maintain. The yard work alone—" "I have a landscaping service," I interrupted. "The same one I've used for 5 years. But what about repairs? Upkeep? It's a big responsibility for someone your age." There it was again, someone your age, as if turning 65 had suddenly rendered me incapable of basic adult functions. "Emily, let me ask you something. When you needed money for your down payment 3 years ago, who provided it? You did, but... And when Michael wanted to expand his law practice, who reviewed his business plan and approved his loan? You did. But Mom, that's different. And when Sarah was going through her divorce and needed both financial and emotional support, who was there for her? You were, but... So explain to me how the woman who was competent enough to help all of you with major life decisions is suddenly too old and frail to live in her own home or take a vacation to Hawaii." There was a long pause. "Mom, we're not saying you're incompetent. We're just saying that maybe it's time to start thinking about making some changes. Simplifying your life." "Whose life, Emily? Mine or yours?" "What do you mean?" "I mean, is this really about my well-being, or is it about making your lives easier? Not having to worry about checking on the old lady? Maybe positioning yourselves better for inheritance planning? That's not fair, Mom. We love you and we're concerned about you. If you love me, then treat me with the respect I've earned. I built a successful investment portfolio. I maintain my home. I'm in better physical shape than most people my age. Yet you want to exclude me from family activities and warehouse me in a senior community because it makes you more comfortable. Emily's Voice took on a defensive edge. We're not trying to warehouse you. We're trying to look out for your best interests. My best interests according to whom? Did anyone ask what I wanted? Did anyone consider that maybe I like my independence? That maybe I'm not ready to be shuffled off to play bingo and water aerobics with people who have actually given up on life? Mom, you're being dramatic. Am I? Emily, answer me honestly. When you and your brother and sister made the decision to exclude me from the Hawaii trip, did you spend even 5 minutes considering my feelings? Or did you just decide among yourselves what was best for the old lady and expect me to go along with it? The silence stretched long enough that I had my answer. I thought so, I said quietly. Well, Emily, I have some news for you. This old lady isn't nearly as fragile or compliant as you seem to think. In fact, I'm about to make some changes in my life that might surprise you. What kind of changes? The kind that prove I'm still perfectly capable of making my own decisions. Give my love to Michael and Sarah. And Emily, you might want to reconsider your assumptions about what someone my age is capable of achieving. I hung up the phone and sat in the gathering darkness of my patio, anger and determination coursing through me in equal measure. My own offspring had not only excluded me from their vacation, they were actively planning to manage me into irrelevance, making decisions about my life without my input or consent. They thought they knew what was best for me because they saw me as a declining old woman who needed their protection and guidance. What they didn't realize was that they were about to learn exactly how wrong their assumptions were. Tomorrow, I would begin the process of acquiring their airline. And when they boarded that plane to Hawaii, they would be flying on an aircraft owned by the woman they had dismissed as too old and frail for their vacation. The irony was going to be absolutely delicious. The next morning, I woke up with the kind of crystalline focus that only comes from making a decision that will change everything. The conversation with Emily had been the final push I needed. If my offspring were determined to treat me like an incompetent old woman who needed their management and protection, then I would show them exactly what this incompetent old woman was capable of achieving. I dressed carefully that morning. My navy blue power suit, the one I wore to important board meetings, paired with the pearl necklace Harold had given me for our 20th anniversary. If I was going to acquire an airline, I was going to look the part. My first call was to Robert, at 7:30 sharp. Sophia, he answered, sounding slightly groggy. You're up early. Robert, I need you to expedite the Pacific Coast Airways acquisition. I want preliminary agreements drafted by the end of this week. This week? Sophia, that's incredibly aggressive. There are due diligence requirements, regulatory filings. Then we'd better get started immediately. Schedule another meeting with their executives for this afternoon. And Robert, I want you to be very clear with them that this is not a casual inquiry. I'm prepared to move forward with or without their cooperation. There was a pause. Sophia, can I ask what's driving this timeline? Yesterday you seemed interested but measured. Today you sound like you're on a mission. I looked out my office window at the desert morning, thinking about how to explain without sounding petty. Let's just say I've had some clarity about my priorities. This acquisition isn't just a business opportunity anymore, it's a statement. What kind of statement? The kind that proves 65 is nowhere near finished. The meeting that afternoon was entirely different from our first encounter. Word had apparently spread within Pacific Coast Airways that I was a serious buyer, with serious money. Thomas Martinez arrived with a full legal team and a stack of documents thicker than a phone book. Mrs. Brown, he said as we settled around the conference table, we've had a chance to review your proposal more thoroughly, and we're very interested in moving forward. However, there are some complexities we need to discuss. Such as? James. Johnson leaned forward. The regulatory approval process with the FAA and Department of Transportation typically takes 4 to 6 months minimum. There are background checks, financial verification requirements, operational assessments. How long if we expedite? I interrupted. Expedite? Martinez looked puzzled. Mrs. Brown, these are federal agencies. they don't typically expedite. Airline acquisitions. I smiled the same smile I'd used earlier. Mr. Martinez, everything can be expedited if you know the right people and have the right incentives. I didn't build a $12 million portfolio by accepting bureaucratic timelines as immutable facts. Johnson and Martinez exchanged glances. I could see them reassessing their assumptions about the polite older woman sitting across from them. "What kind of timeline are you thinking?" Johnson asked cautiously. "I want operational control within 8 weeks. Full legal transfer within 12 weeks, that's..." Martinez started to object, then stopped himself. "That would require some very creative structuring." "Then let's get creative." What would it take? The next 2 hours were spent in intense negotiation over details that would have bored most people to tears, but energized me completely. Management agreements, operational oversight contracts, regulatory filing strategies. We covered every possible angle for accelerating the acquisition. By the time we concluded, we had outlined a deal structure that would give me effective control of Pacific Coast Airways within 6 weeks, with full ownership transfer to follow once regulatory approvals were complete. "Mrs. Brown," Johnson said as we wrapped up, "I have to ask, what's your long-term vision for the airline? Are you looking at this as a financial investment, or do you plan to be actively involved in operations?" "Mr. Johnson, I plan to be very actively involved. In fact, I intend to make Pacific Coast Airways a showcase for what's possible when you don't underestimate people based on their age or assumptions about their capabilities." As I drove home that evening, I felt a satisfaction deeper than any I'd experienced in years. But the real test was yet to come. I needed to tell my family what I was doing, and I needed to do it in a way that would maximize the impact of the message I was sending. That night, I drafted an email to Emily, Michael, and Sarah. I wrote and rewrote it several times, wanting to strike exactly the right tone, not vindictive, but unmistakably clear about what I was doing and why. Why? Subject: Recent family discussions. Dear Emily, Michael, and Sarah, I wanted to follow up on our recent conversations about my age, health, and apparently declining capabilities. After giving your concerns careful consideration, I've decided, you're absolutely right. It's time for me to make some significant changes in my life. Effective immediately, I am acquiring Pacific Coast Airways, the airline you've booked for your Hawaiian vacation. The preliminary agreements will be signed this Friday, with operational control transferring to me within 6 weeks. I want to assure you that despite my advanced age and supposedly declining mental faculties, I will ensure that your flight operates safely and on schedule. Consider it my contribution to your family vacation, the one I was deemed too old and frail to attend. I also wanted to address Emily's suggestion about senior living communities. After careful consideration, I've decided that rather than simplifying my life, I'm going to complicate it considerably. Running an airline should provide exactly the kind of challenge and stimulation that someone my age apparently shouldn't attempt. I'm sure you're wondering how your 65-year-old mother managed to acquire an airline, the same way she built a $12 million investment portfolio through careful analysis, bold decision-making, and the advantage of being consistently underestimated by people who mistake age for incompetence. I hope you have a wonderful time in Hawaii. I'll be sure to personally review the service quality reports from your flights. With love and renewed energy, Mom PS, I've decided against the senior living community. This house has excellent Wi-Fi for running an airline, and the home office converts nicely into a command center. I read the email 3 times before hitting send, my heart pounding with nervous excitement. There was no taking it back now. I had just informed my offspring that their mother, the woman they considered too old for a family vacation, had acquired the airline they were planning to fly on. Within minutes, my phone started ringing. Emily's name appeared on the screen. I let it go to voicemail. Then Michael called. Voicemail, then Sarah. Also voicemail. I poured myself a glass of wine and sat on my patio, watching the desert stars emerge in the clear night sky. The phone kept ringing, first individual calls from each of them, then what appeared to be a three-way conference call based on the timing. I didn't answer any of them. They had excluded me from their family discussions about my life and future. Now they could experience what it felt like to be excluded from a major family announcement. The woman they had dismissed as too old and frail for their Hawaiian vacation had just acquired their airline. And this was only the beginning of what Sophia Brown was capable of achieving when she stopped worrying about other people's limitations and started focusing on her own possibilities. Tomorrow, I would start learning how to run an airline. Tonight, I was going to enjoy the satisfaction of knowing that my family was finally beginning to understand exactly who they were dealing with. I woke up the next morning to 17 missed calls, 43 text messages, and an inbox full of increasingly frantic emails from my offspring. The first wave had been disbelief. The second wave was anger. The third wave, which was still coming in as I sipped my morning coffee on the patio, was full-scale panic mixed with attempts at emotional manipulation. Emily's voicemail from 11:47 p.m. was particularly memorable. "Mom, this is insane. You can't just buy an airline because you're upset about Hawaii. This isn't some stock purchase. You're talking about people's jobs, safety regulations, federal oversight. Please call me back. We need to talk about this before you do something. You'll regret." Michael's approach was more legalistic. "Mom, I've been researching airline acquisitions, and the regulatory requirements are enormous. The liability exposure alone could wipe out your entire net worth. As your son and as an attorney, I'm strongly advising you to reconsider this decision. Let's schedule a meeting to discuss your options." Sarah, ever the doctor, had taken the psychological approach. "Mom, I'm worried that you're making major life decisions based on emotional reactions. That's not like you. Maybe we should talk to someone about healthy ways to process these feelings. I can recommend some excellent therapists who specialize in life transitions for seniors." Life transitions for seniors. Even when they were panicking about my business decisions, they couldn't resist reminding me of my age. I deleted all the messages without responding and spent the morning reviewing the preliminary contracts Robert had sent over. The legal language was dense, but the core elements were exactly what we had negotiated. I was 3 signatures away from becoming the majority owner of an airline. At 10:30, my doorbell rang. Through the front window, I could see Emily's silver SUV in my driveway, and all 3 of my offspring standing on my porch, looking like a delegation of concerned relatives staging an intervention. I considered not answering, but that felt unnecessarily dramatic. Instead, I opened the door with my most pleasant smile. "Good morning," I said cheerfully. "This is unexpected. Don't you all have jobs to attend to?" Emily stepped forward, clearly designated as the spokesperson. "Mom, we need to talk. Can we come in?" "Of course," I said, stepping aside. "Coffee? I just made a fresh pot." They followed me into the kitchen, their expressions ranging from worried to barely controlled anger. Michael was carrying a briefcase, which suggested this was going to be more formal than a typical family discussion. "Mom," Emily began, settling onto one of the bar stools at my kitchen island, "we got your email last night." "I assumed so, given the volume of messages you left." Sarah leaned forward, her doctor voice in full effect. "Mom, we're concerned that you're making impulsive decisions based on emotional reactions. Buying an airline is not a normal response to a family disagreement." I poured myself another cup of coffee, taking my time with the cream and sugar. "Sarah, what exactly do you consider a normal response? Quietly accepting your assessment of my limitations? Gracefully fading into the background of my own family? That's not what we're doing," Michael interjected, opening his briefcase and pulling out a stack of papers. "Mom, I've been researching Pacific Coast Airways. They're in serious financial trouble. Their debt-to-asset ratio is catastrophic. You could lose everything." I glanced at his research, recognizing most of the same sources I had consulted. Michael, what makes you think I haven't done my own due diligence? Because this isn't your area of expertise. You've never run an airline. You don't understand the operational complexities, the regulatory environment, the unions. You're right, I interrupted calmly. I've never run an airline. 8 years ago, I had also never managed a stock portfolio. 5 years ago, I had never served on a corporate board. 3 years ago, I had never negotiated a commercial real estate deal. Somehow, I managed to figure those things out. Emily tried a different approach. Mom, we're not questioning your intelligence or your business skills. We're just concerned about the scale of this decision. It's not just your money at risk. It's an entire company with employees and customers. Emily, do you think I'm too old and incompetent to run an airline? Or are you worried that I might actually succeed? The question hung in the air. I could see them struggling with how to respond without sounding like they were betting against me. Sarah finally spoke up. Mom, this feels like you're trying to prove a point rather than making a sound business decision. And what point would that be? That you're not too old for Hawaii or whatever this is really about. I set down my coffee cup and looked at each of them in turn. You're absolutely right, Sarah. I am trying to prove a point. The point is that the woman you've been treating like a declining invalid is still perfectly capable of making bold, complex business decisions. The point is that excluding me from family activities because you've decided I'm too frail is not only hurtful, it's spectacularly wrong. Michael leaned forward. Mom, even if you could successfully run an airline, the timing is terrible. You're doing this out of anger. I'm doing this out of clarity, I corrected. For months, you've been making decisions about my life based on your assumptions about my limitations. You excluded me from vacation planning. Emily suggested I move to a senior community. You speak to me like I'm a child who can't understand complex concepts. This acquisition is my way of demonstrating that your assumptions are not just wrong, they're absurdly wrong. Emily's voice took on a pleading tone. Mom, please. We're sorry about Hawaii. We're sorry if we've been overprotective, but don't risk your entire financial future to make a point. Risk my financial future? Emily, I've spent 8 years building my financial future. I've diversified my investments, maintained excellent credit, and built a portfolio that gives me options. This airline acquisition represents approximately 70% of my liquid assets. Significant, but not financially devastating. But what if it fails? Sarah asked. What if you lose everything? I smiled, recognizing the fundamental difference in our approaches to life. Sarah, what if I succeed? What if I turn Pacific Coast Airways into a profitable, efficient airline that serves its customers well and provides good jobs for its employees? What if I prove that age and experience are assets rather than liabilities in business? Michael shook his head. Mom, the statistics on airline acquisitions are terrible. Most fail within 5 years. Most are also acquired by people who've never built anything from scratch. Most are run by people who've never had to prove themselves, while being consistently underestimated. I have certain advantages that don't show up in statistics. The conversation continued for another hour, with my offspring cycling through every argument they could think of. Financial risk, operational complexity, regulatory burden, potential stress on my health, impact on family relationships. They covered every possible objection except the one that mattered most. Not once did any of them say, Mom, we believe in your ability to succeed. Not once did they say, we're sorry we underestimated you. Not once did they acknowledge that maybe, just maybe, their 65-year-old mother knew what she was doing. Instead, they were so focused on protecting me from my own supposed limitations that they couldn't see the woman sitting in front of them, the one who had built a fortune through careful analysis and bold decision-making, who was in excellent health despite their concerns, who had every qualification necessary to succeed, except the one thing they valued most, youth. When they finally left, promising to continue this conversation, and asking me to please not sign anything until we talk again, I felt more determined than ever. Their resistance wasn't about protecting me from financial risk or business failure. It was about protecting themselves from having to acknowledge that their assumptions about my capabilities were completely wrong. Well, they were about to get a very expensive lesson in the dangers of underestimating Sophia Brown. The morning after my family's intervention attempt, I drove to Robert's office with the signed acquisition contracts in my briefcase and a determination that felt almost physical in its intensity. The desert sunrise painted the mountains in shades of gold and pink, and I took it as a good omen for what I was about to accomplish. "Sophia," Robert said as I entered his office, "I have to ask one more time. Are you absolutely certain about this? Your family called me yesterday expressing some concerns." I set my briefcase on his desk with a decisive thud. "Robert, my family called you?" He looked uncomfortable. "Michael reached out. As your attorney, he was worried about the financial implications of such a large acquisition. He asked if I could help talk you out of it." The betrayal stung, but it also crystallized my resolve. "Robert, let me be very clear. My family does not speak for me in business matters. They have no legal standing in my affairs, and they certainly have no authority to interfere with my investment decisions. Are we understood?" "Of course. I just wanted to make sure you had considered all perspectives." "I have. And my perspective is that I'm about to prove to everyone, including myself, exactly what this 65-year-old woman is capable of achieving." I opened my briefcase and pulled out the contracts, each page signed and initialed with my distinctive signature. "These are ready for filing. How quickly can we move on the regulatory submissions?" Robert reviewed the documents, his expression shifting from concern to professional admiration. "You've structured this brilliantly, Sophia. The management contract provision allows you to take operational control immediately, while the ownership transfer processes through regulatory approval. I have to admit, this is more sophisticated than most acquisitions I've seen. I didn't build a $12 million portfolio by accident, Robert. Over the next 2 weeks, I threw myself into learning the airline business with an intensity I hadn't felt since the early days after Harold's death. I read everything: industry publications, regulatory manuals, operational guides, financial analyses of competitor airlines. I studied route maps, maintenance schedules, crew rotation patterns, and customer service metrics. My home office transformed into mission command for Pacific Coast Airways. I installed additional phone lines, upgraded my internet connection, and set up multiple monitors to track everything from weather patterns affecting flight schedules to real-time fuel price fluctuations. The first time I walked into Pacific Coast Airways headquarters in Phoenix, wearing my Navy suit and carrying a briefcase full of operational questions, I could feel the staff's surprise. Word had spread that the new owner was a 65-year-old woman, but seeing me in person seemed to catch them off guard. "Mrs. Brown," James Johnson greeted me in the lobby. "Welcome to Pacific Coast Airways. Are you ready for the grand tour?" "I'm ready to get to work," I replied. "Let's start with operations." The tour was eye-opening. The airline was indeed struggling financially, but the bones of the operation were solid. The maintenance facility was well organized and staffed with experienced technicians. The fleet, while aging, was well maintained and reliable. The route network made sense geographically and served markets with strong demand. What was lacking was leadership and vision. The previous ownership had been reactive rather than proactive, cutting costs indiscriminately rather than investing. Strategically, they had deferred maintenance on everything from aircraft to employee morale. "What's our on-time performance?" I asked the operations manager, a woman named Patricia who had been with the company for 15 years. 78%, she admitted. Industry average is 85%. What are the primary causes of delays? Maintenance issues, crew scheduling problems, weather contingencies we don't plan for adequately. I made notes on my tablet. And customer complaints? Mostly about delays in communication. Passengers don't mind waiting if they know what's happening and when they can expect resolution. Show me the crew scheduling system. What I found was an antiquated computer system that required manual coordination between departments. Crew scheduling was done on spreadsheets. Maintenance tracking relied on paper records that were transferred to digital systems days later. No wonder they had operational problems. Patricia, I said after reviewing their systems, if you had unlimited budget and authority, what would you fix first? Her eyes lit up. The scheduling system. Everything else flows from that. Crew coordination, maintenance planning, customer communication. If we could see everything in real time and respond proactively instead of reactively, we could solve 80% of our operational problems. Consider it done. I want recommendations for integrated scheduling systems on my desk by Friday. Budget is not a constraint. Over the following weeks, I dove deeper into every aspect of the airline's operations. I flew on Pacific Coast flights. As a passenger, taking notes on everything from check-in procedures to cabin cleanliness. I interviewed employees at every level, from baggage handlers to pilots to customer service representatives. What I found was a workforce that cared deeply about the company but had been demoralized by years of cost-cutting and poor leadership. They had ideas for improvement, but had never been asked for their input. They took pride in their work, but lacked the tools and support to excel. Mrs. Brown, said Captain William Jones during one of my pilot interviews, I've been flying for Pacific Coast for 12 years. I've seen 3 different ownership groups, and they all focused on cutting costs. You're the first owner who's asked about improving service. Captain Jones, what would improve service from your perspective? Better maintenance scheduling, so we're not dealing with unexpected mechanical issues. More realistic flight scheduling, so we're not always racing to make up time. And basic amenities for passengers. The planes haven't been refurbished in 8 years. I made more notes. What would it take to make Pacific Coast Airways an airline you'd recommend to your friends? Thought for a moment. Reliability, comfort, and staff who feel valued enough to provide excellent service. Right now, we're batting about 50% on all 3. Then let's get to work on the other 50%. My family's resistance continued throughout this period, but with decreasing intensity. Emily called weekly to ask if I was overwhelmed by the complexity of running an airline. Michael sent articles about airline bankruptcies and regulatory challenges. Sarah expressed concern about the stress levels associated with such a demanding business. What they didn't seem to notice was that I was thriving. I had more energy than I'd felt in years. I was learning new skills, solving complex problems, and working with dedicated people who were grateful for real leadership and investment in their success. The transformation wasn't just in the airline. It was in me. I was no longer the accommodating widow who stepped aside to make room for other people's priorities. I was Sophia Brown, airline owner, making decisions that affected hundreds of employees and thousands of passengers. 3. Weeks into my operational control of Pacific Coast Airways, I received my first customer service compliment letter. A passenger wrote to thank us for the professional handling of a weather delay, the clear communication throughout the process, and the courtesy of our staff during a stressful situation. I framed that letter and hung it in my office, not because it was extraordinary praise, but because it represented something I hadn't felt in years. The satisfaction of building something worthwhile, of proving that experience and determination were more valuable than youth and assumptions. My family thought I was too old for their Hawaiian vacation. Instead, I had acquired the airline that would take them there, and I was transforming it into something better than it had ever been. The journey was just beginning. 6 weeks after taking operational control of Pacific Coast Airways, I stood in the newly renovated executive conference room, looking out at 25 department heads and senior staff members who had gathered for our first quarterly planning meeting. The room itself was symbolic of the changes we were implementing. Gone were the worn carpets and outdated furniture, replaced with modern conference tables, ergonomic chairs, and state-of-the-art presentation equipment. But the real transformation wasn't in the decor. It was in the energy of the people around that table. "Ladies and gentlemen," I began, adjusting my reading glasses and opening the leather portfolio that had become my constant companion. 3 months ago, Pacific Coast. Airways was hemorrhaging money, disappointing customers, and demoralizing employees. Today, I'm pleased to report that we've turned the corner on all 3 fronts. Patricia, our operations manager, smiled as she pulled up the first slide on the presentation screen. Our on-time performance has improved from 78% to 91%, 4 points above industry average. Customer complaints are down 62%, and employee satisfaction scores have increased by 45%. The room buzzed with quiet pride. These weren't just statistics. They represented thousands of passengers who reached their destinations on time, hundreds of employees who felt valued and empowered, and a company that was finally living up to its potential. How did we achieve these improvements so quickly? I asked, though I already knew the answer. I wanted the team to hear it articulated. Captain Jones, who had become one of my most trusted advisors, leaned forward. Investment in systems, respect for employee input, and leadership that actually listens. We've been saying for years what needed to be fixed. Mrs. Brown was the first owner to act on our recommendations. The new integrated scheduling system had been the cornerstone of our operational improvements. Instead of the antiquated spreadsheet-based approach, we now had real-time coordination between maintenance, crew scheduling, weather monitoring, and customer communication. When delays were unavoidable, passengers received immediate notifications with rebooking options and realistic timelines. But technology was only part of the equation. The bigger change was cultural. "Thomas," I said, turning to our head of maintenance, "tell us about the preventive maintenance program." Thomas Martinez, not to be confused with the CFO from our acquisition meetings, had been with Pacific Coast for 8 years. Under previous ownership, he had watched his maintenance budget get cut repeatedly, forcing his team into reactive repairs instead of preventive care. Mrs. Brown approved a complete overhaul of our maintenance approach, he explained. Instead of waiting for things to break, we're now staying ahead of potential problems. Aircraft availability is up, unexpected mechanical delays are down, and frankly, I sleep better at night knowing our planes are getting the care they deserve. The financial results were equally impressive. Revenue was up 18%, driven primarily by improved customer satisfaction and word-of-mouth recommendations. More importantly, our cost per passenger had decreased as operational efficiency improved. The Phoenix to San Diego road is now our most profitable, reported our new CFO, a brilliant woman named Mia Garcia, whom I had recruited from Southwest Airlines. Customer loyalty on that route has increased dramatically. We're seeing repeat bookings at rates comparable to major carriers. As the meeting progressed, I found myself marveling at the transformation in our corporate culture. 6 months ago, these same employees had been resigned to working for a failing airline with indifferent leadership. Now they were engaged, innovative, and proud of their contributions to our success. "Mrs. Brown," said Jennifer, our customer service director, "I wanted to share something that happened yesterday. A passenger missed her connection in Phoenix due to traffic, and instead of just rebooking her on tomorrow's flight, our agent researched alternative routing through our partner airlines and got her to her destination only 2 hours later than originally planned." "That's excellent customer service," I acknowledged. "But tell me why that's noteworthy." "Because under the old ownership, we weren't authorized to book passengers on partner airlines. The additional cost was considered too expensive. Now we're empowered to make decisions that prioritize customer satisfaction over short-term cost savings." This was exactly the kind of transformation I had envisioned. Employees who felt trusted and empowered made better decisions. Better decisions led to happier customers. Happier customers generated more revenue and positive word of mouth. It was a virtuous cycle that previous ownership had never understood. After the meeting, I retreated to my office, a space I had completely redesigned to reflect both the airline's heritage and its future aspirations. The walls displayed vintage aviation photographs alongside charts showing our improving performance metrics, i.e., desk, positioned to overlook the operations floor, gave me a direct view of the daily activity that kept our flights moving. I was reviewing route expansion proposals when my assistant, David, knocked on the door. "Mrs. Brown, there's a reporter from Aviation Weekly here to see you. She says she's doing a story about your acquisition and turnaround of Pacific Coast Airways." I had been expecting this. Our rapid improvement had attracted attention within the aviation industry, and several publications had requested interviews. "Send her in, David." The reporter, a woman in her 30s named Lisa Chen, entered with a notebook and recording device. "Mrs. Brown, thank you for taking the time to speak with me. I have to say your story is quite remarkable. A 65-year-old woman with no aviation experience acquires a struggling airline and turns it around in less than 3 months. How do you explain that?" I smiled, recognizing the subtle surprise in her voice that I had grown accustomed to hearing. "Ms. Chen, I think you're asking the wrong question. The question isn't how someone my age accomplished this turnaround. The question is why previous ownership failed to implement such obvious improvements." "What do you mean?" "Every improvement we've made was suggested by existing employees who understood the problems and had solutions. The integrated scheduling system, the preventive maintenance program, the customer service empowerment. These weren't my innovations. They were recommendations from people who had been working in this industry for years, but had never been listened to." She scribbled notes rapidly. "So you're saying experience and listening skills matter more than industry background?" "I'm saying that success in any business comes from understanding your customers' needs, investing in your employees' capabilities, and making decisions based on data rather than assumptions. Those principles work whether you're running an airline or managing a stock portfolio." Speaking of assumptions, there's been some industry speculation about whether this turnaround is sustainable. Some analysts suggest that a 65-year-old CEO might not have the energy for the long-term demands of running an airline. I leaned back in my chair, considering how to address this predictable question. "Ms. Chen, I'm curious about those analysts. How many of them have actually built a business from the ground up? How many have successfully managed a major turnaround? Because I've done both, and I've found that wisdom and experience are far more valuable than youth and assumptions." "What would you say to other women your age who might be considering major career changes or business ventures?" "I'd say that the biggest limitation most of us face isn't age. It's other people's expectations about what age should mean. I spent years accepting my family's assessment that I was becoming too old and frail for new adventures. The moment I stopped accepting their limitations and started focusing on my own capabilities, everything changed." As the interview concluded and Ms. Chen left, I reflected on how dramatically my identity had shifted in just a few months. I was no longer primarily Harold's widow or Emily's mother or someone's aging grandmother who needed protection from life's complexities. I was Sophia Brown, CEO of Pacific Coast Airways. I was a woman who had identified an undervalued asset, acquired it strategically, and transformed it into a success story that was attracting national attention. Most importantly, I was a person who had stopped letting other people define what was possible for her life. The transformation was complete, but the adventure was just beginning. The call came on a Tuesday morning in early November, just as I was reviewing the quarterly financial reports that showed Pacific Coast Airways had achieved profitability 2 months ahead of our most optimistic projections. Emily's name appeared on my phone screen, and for the first time in months, I decided to answer immediately instead of letting it go to voicemail. "Hi, Mom," she said, her voice carrying a tone I hadn't heard in years. Something between respect and nervousness. "Do you have a few minutes to talk?" "Of course, Emily. What's on your mind?" I saw the article about you in Aviation Weekly and the piece in the Wall Street Journal yesterday about Pacific Coast Airways turnaround. I had expected this call eventually. The media attention surrounding our airline's transformation had been significant, with several major publications running features about the unlikely CEO who had acquired a failing airline and turned it around in record time. The coverage had been universally positive, though most articles couldn't resist emphasizing my age as if it were an exotic curiosity. "What did you think of the articles?" I asked, genuinely curious about her reaction. "Mom, I owe you an apology, a big one." Her voice wavered slightly. "When you sent that email about buying the airline, I thought you were having some kind of breakdown. I was actually researching elder care attorneys to see if we could intervene legally." The admission stung, but I appreciated her honesty. "You thought I was mentally incompetent?" "I thought you were making impulsive decisions based on hurt feelings. I never imagined that you were actually going to succeed at running an airline. The numbers in these articles are incredible, Mom. You've turned the company around completely." I set down the financial reports and walked to my office window, looking out at the operations floor where our afternoon shift was coordinating departures. "Emily, what changed your mind? The media coverage or the actual results?" "Both, I guess. But mostly it was realizing that I never actually questioned whether you could do it. I just assumed you couldn't because of your age. That was wrong of me." This was the conversation I had been hoping for but hadn't dared to expect. "Emily, can I ask you something? When you and Michael and Sarah decided I was too old for the Hawaii trip, did you consider that I might have feelings about being excluded?" There was a long pause. "Honestly, no. We convinced ourselves we were protecting you from something that would be too difficult, but we never asked what you wanted. We never considered that maybe you were looking forward to spending time with us." I said quietly. "I had been thinking about joining you for months. I was excited about watching the grandkids experience Hawaii for the first time, about having uninterrupted time with all of you away from everyday distractions." "Oh, Mom." Emily's voice was thick with emotion. "I'm so sorry. We were trying to be considerate, but we were actually being incredibly selfish. We made assumptions about your limitations instead of asking about your capabilities." "The assumptions were the hardest part," I admitted, being treated like I was becoming incompetent when I had just spent years proving exactly the opposite. "How can we fix this? How can we rebuild what we damaged?" I considered the question carefully. The relationship couldn't simply return to what it had been before. Too much had changed, and honestly, the old dynamic hadn't been healthy anyway. But something new could be built if we were both willing to be honest about what needed to change. "Emily, I need you to see me as I actually, not as you think I should be at my age. I'm 65, but I'm not fragile or declining or in need of management. I'm actually thriving in ways I never expected. I can see that now. The airline success isn't just about business skills. You've built something impressive from scratch. I should have recognized that you were capable of this level of achievement." 2 days later, Michael called with his own apology, though his approach was characteristically analytical. "Mom, I've been reviewing Pacific Coast Airways' financial turnaround, and I have to admit I was completely wrong about the acquisition. Your debt-to-equity restructuring was brilliant, and the operational improvements have generated exactly the kind of sustainable revenue growth that creates long-term value." "Thank you, Michael. That means a lot coming from you. I also want to apologize for calling Robert and trying to interfere with your business decisions. That was inappropriate, and it revealed that I wasn't treating you as the competent adult you obviously are." "Michael, can I ask what changed your perspective?" "Honestly, I realized that if any of my clients had achieved what you've accomplished with Pacific Coast Airways, I'd be congratulating them on their business acumen and strategic vision. The only reason I questioned your judgment was because you're my mother, and I had somehow started thinking of you as someone who needed protection instead of someone who had built a fortune through smart decisions." Sarah's call came the following week, and her apology was the most emotional of the three. "Mom, I've been thinking about what I said about senior living communities and therapy for life transitions," she began, her voice heavy with regret. "I realize now that I was essentially telling you to give up on having an interesting life because you had reached an arbitrary age threshold. Sarah, you were concerned about my well-being. I understand that. But my concern was based on stereotypes about aging, not on any actual assessment of your health or capabilities. You're in better physical and mental shape than most of my patients who are decades younger. I should have been celebrating your energy and ambition, not trying to convince you to settle for less. What made you realize that?" "A patient of mine, actually. She's 73 and just started her own consulting business after retiring from corporate work. When she told me about it, my first thought was, good for her. But then I realized I had been discouraging my own mother from pursuing challenges that were far less demanding than running a business. The most significant change came when they invited me to Thanksgiving dinner. Not as a gesture of obligation, but with genuine excitement about hearing more about the airline business and my plans for expansion. "Mom," Emily said when I arrived, at her house in Phoenix, "we want to hear everything about Pacific Coast Airways. Michael's been researching the aviation industry, and Sarah's been bragging to her colleagues about her CEO mother. For the first time in years, I felt like they were genuinely interested in my life as something more than a concern to be managed." The conversation over dinner was animated, with all three of them asking thoughtful questions about operational challenges, growth strategies, and industry dynamics. "Are you planning to acquire other airlines?" Michael asked as we discussed expansion possibilities. "I'm exploring some opportunities," I said. "There are several small regional carriers that would benefit from the same kind of operational improvements we've implemented at Pacific Coast." "That would be a brilliant strategy," he said with genuine enthusiasm. "Create a network of efficiently run regional airlines that can compete with the major carriers on service quality." As I drove home that evening, I reflected on how dramatically our family dynamic had shifted. The conversation at dinner hadn't been about my age or their concerns about my limitations. It had been about my business, my achievements, and my plans for the future. They were finally seeing me as I actually was, Sophia Brown, successful entrepreneur and airline CEO, who happened to be their 65-year-old mother. The relationship hadn't just been repaired. It had been rebuilt on a foundation of mutual respect rather than protective condescension. The phone call that changed everything came on a crisp December morning while I was reviewing our holiday flight schedules. My assistant David knocked on my office door with an expression I had never seen before, equal parts excitement and disbelief. "Mrs. Brown, you have a call from the White House. The Department of Transportation wants to speak with you about serving on the National Aviation Advisory Committee." I set down my coffee cup carefully, certain I had misheard. "I'm sorry. What?" "The Department of Transportation. They want you to advise on aviation policy at the federal level. Something about your innovative approaches to airline operations and customer service." The call was from Deputy Secretary Jennifer Walsh, a woman whose reputation in aviation circles was legendary. "Mrs. Brown," she said after brief pleasantries, "your turnaround of Pacific Coast Airways has attracted significant attention here in Washington. We're particularly interested in your employee empowerment model and your preventive maintenance approach. Would you be interested in sharing these strategies with other industry leaders?" "I'm honored by the invitation," I replied, though part of me was still processing the surreal nature of the conversation. What would the commitment involve? Quarterly meetings in Washington, participation in policy development sessions, and consultation on regulatory frameworks that could encourage the kind of operational excellence you've achieved. The committee advises the Secretary on aviation safety, efficiency, and customer service standards. As I hung up the phone 20 minutes later, having accepted the appointment, I couldn't help but smile at the irony. 6 months ago, my own family had considered me too old and frail for a vacation to Hawaii. Now the federal government was asking me to help shape national aviation policy. The recognition continued to accelerate throughout December. Harvard Business School invited me to speak at their executive leadership program about rapid organizational transformation. The International Aviation Management Association asked me to deliver the keynote address at their annual conference. Forbes magazine wanted to feature Pacific Coast Airways in their Corporate Turnaround Success Stories issue. But the recognition that meant the most came from an unexpected source. I was in my office late one Friday evening, reviewing applications for our new pilot training program, when Patricia knocked on my door. "Mrs. Brown, do you have a few minutes? There's something the staff wanted to present to you." I followed her to the main operations floor, where I found nearly 50 employees gathered in an impromptu celebration. Someone had arranged catering, and a large banner hung from the ceiling reading, "Thank you, Mrs. Brown, for seeing our potential." Captain Jones stepped forward, holding a framed photograph. "Mrs. Brown, when you took over Pacific Coast Airways, you didn't just save our jobs. You gave us back our professional pride. This company feels like a real airline again, not just a struggling business waiting to fail." The photograph was a composite of images from our operational improvements over the past 6 months. The new scheduling system in action, aircraft undergoing preventive maintenance, customer service representatives empowered to solve problems creatively, and employees working together with renewed energy and purpose. "We wanted you to know," added Thomas from maintenance, "that what you've accomplished here isn't just about business metrics. You've changed people's lives. My daughter told her school class that her dad works for the best airline in Arizona now, and she's proud of what I do." As I looked around at the faces of people who had become more than employees, they had become collaborators in building something meaningful, I felt a profound sense of accomplishment that went far beyond financial success. "Ladies and gentlemen," I said, accepting the framed photograph. "When I acquired this airline, I thought I was making a point about not being underestimated. What I discovered was that I was actually finding my life's most meaningful work. You've taught me as much as I've hopefully contributed to your success." The following week brought an invitation that initially seemed routine, but turned out to be transformational in ways I hadn't expected. The Phoenix Chamber of Commerce asked me to speak at their Women in Leadership luncheon about my transition from widow to airline CEO. The audience of about 200 women ranged in age from recent college graduates to women in their 70s. As I looked out at the crowd before beginning my presentation, I noticed something that struck me. The older women in the audience were sitting toward the back, as if they expected to be less relevant to a discussion about leadership and achievement. "Ladies," I began, departing from my prepared remarks, "I want to start with a question for everyone over 50 in this room. How many of you have been told, directly or indirectly, that your best years are behind you?" Hands went up throughout the room, but they were concentrated among the women my age and older. I thought so. 6 months ago, I would have raised my hand too. My own family had convinced me that at 65, I was too old for adventure, too frail for challenges, too set in my ways for new experiences. They suggested I consider moving to a senior living community where I could engage in age-appropriate activities with people who had similarly given up on ambitious goals. A murmur of recognition swept through the audience. Instead, I bought an airline. The laughter that followed was warm and appreciative. Not because I had always dreamed of the aviation business, but because I needed to prove, to them and to myself, that being 65 doesn't mean being finished. I spent the next 30 minutes sharing specific details about the acquisition, the operational challenges, and the turnaround strategy. But more importantly, I talked about the psychological journey from accepting limitations to embracing possibilities. The business skills I used to transform Pacific Coast Airways weren't new, I explained. I had been developing them for years while managing my investment portfolio. The analytical thinking, the strategic planning, the leadership capabilities, they were all there. What was missing was permission to use them for something ambitious. After my presentation, I was approached by dozens of women who shared their own stories of being sidelined by age-based assumptions. A 62-year-old former marketing executive who had been told she was overqualified, code for too old, for positions she was clearly capable of performing. A 58-year-old engineer who had been passed over for promotions in favor of younger colleagues with less experience. A 67-year-old artist who had stopped submitting her work to galleries because she assumed they wouldn't be interested in someone her age. "Mrs. Brown," said a woman named Margaret who was probably in her early 70s, "your story gives me hope. I've been wanting to start a nonprofit focused on literacy programs, but everyone tells me it's too late in life for such a major undertaking." "Margaret," I replied, "the question isn't whether you're too old to start a nonprofit. The question is whether you have the passion, skills, and determination to make it successful. Age is irrelevant to those factors." As I drove home that afternoon, I realized that the recognition I was receiving wasn't just about business success. It was about challenging assumptions that limit people's potential based on arbitrary factors like age. Pacific Coast Airways had become more than a profitable airline. It had become a symbol of what's possible when experience and determination are valued over youth and conformity. The woman who had been excluded from a family vacation because she was supposedly too old and frail was now being consulted by the federal government, featured in national publications, and inspiring other women to reject age-based limitations on their ambitions. The recognition was gratifying, but more importantly, it was creating ripple effects that extended far beyond my individual story. 1 year after acquiring Pacific Coast Airways, I stood in the departure lounge of Phoenix Sky Harbor Airport, watching my family board Flight 447 to Maui. The same Hawaiian vacation they had planned without me 12 months earlier. The difference was that this time, they were flying on my airline, with my pilots, my crew, and my customer service standards. But more importantly, this time, I had been invited. "Mom, are you sure you don't want to come with us?" Emily asked as she approached the gate with her boarding pass in hand. "We booked an extra seat just in case you changed your mind." I smiled, appreciating the gesture while recognizing how much our relationship had evolved. "Thank you, sweetheart, but I have a board meeting in Seattle next week. We're finalizing the acquisition of Mountain West Regional Airways." Michael looked up from his phone with genuine interest. "Another airline acquisition? That would make 3 in 12 months. 4, actually. We closed on Desert Sky Airways last month. The integration is going beautifully. Same operational improvements we implemented at Pacific Coast. Same focus on employee empowerment and customer service excellence." Sarah shook her head with what appeared to be admiration rather than concern. "Mom, you've built an aviation empire. Do you ever think about slowing down?" The question made me laugh. "Sarah, a year ago you wanted me to move into a senior community because you thought I was slowing down too much. Now you're worried I'm not slowing down enough. Maybe the problem isn't my speed. Maybe it's other people's expectations about what someone my age should be doing." As they boarded the plane, I felt a profound sense of satisfaction watching them trust their travel plans to the airline I had built from a failing regional carrier into a respected industry leader. Flight 447 would depart on time, arrive as scheduled, and provide the kind of service experience that had earned Pacific Coast Airways a 96% customer satisfaction rating. The past year had exceeded my most optimistic projections in every measurable way. Pacific Coast Airways was now the third largest regional airline in the western United States, with a fleet of 42 aircraft serving 37 destinations. We employed over 800 people, had maintained an industry-leading safety record, and achieved profit margins that made major carriers envious. But the financial success, while gratifying, wasn't what drove me anymore. What energized me was the transformation I witnessed daily in our employees and passengers. We had Created something that proved business could be both profitable and principled, efficient and empathetic. "Mrs. Brown," said Captain Lisa Thompson, our newest pilot and the first woman to complete our expanded training program, "your flight to Seattle is ready for boarding." Captain Thompson embodied the culture we had built at Pacific Coast Airways. She was 47 years old, had been passed over for captain positions at major airlines because of subtle age and gender bias, and had found with us the opportunity to lead that she deserved. Her story wasn't unique. We had become a destination for experienced professionals who had been undervalued elsewhere. As I settled into my first-class seat, a perk I had finally allowed myself after months of flying in economy to better understand the passenger experience, I reflected on how dramatically my life had changed since that humiliating dinner conversation with my family. The 65-year-old woman who had been deemed too old and frail for a Hawaiian vacation was now flying to Seattle to finalize the acquisition of her fourth airline. The mother who had been excluded from family planning was now consulted by her adult children on major decisions in their own lives. The widow who had been encouraged to downsize her ambitions was now expanding an aviation business that employed nearly 1,000 people across 4 states. My phone buzzed with a text from Emily, sent from the aircraft I owned. "Flight attendant just announced that we're part of the Pacific Coast Airways family. She mentioned that our CEO started this company to prove that experience and determination matter more than age. I'm so proud to be your daughter, Mom." The message brought tears to my eyes, not because of the praise, but because of the recognition it represented. Emily finally saw me as I actually was, not as she thought I should be at my age. During the flight to Seattle, I reviewed the presentation I would be giving the next week at the Harvard Business School Executive Program. The case study they had developed around Pacific Coast Airways' turnaround was being used to teach principles of rapid organizational transformation, but I knew the real lesson wasn't about business strategy. The real lesson was about the cost of underestimating people based on assumptions about their limitations. As we approached Seattle, I thought about the conversation I had scheduled for the following afternoon with the CEO of International Airways, the nation's 4th largest carrier. They wanted to discuss a potential partnership that could revolutionize regional aviation service across the western United States. 2 years ago, such a meeting would have been unimaginable. Major airline executives didn't take seriously the ideas of 65-year-old women with no aviation background. Now they sought my input on industry strategy and operational excellence. The hotel in Seattle where I stayed had become familiar territory. I was there monthly now, either for board meetings of the companies I had acquired or for speaking engagements at business schools and industry conferences. My assistant David managed a calendar that would have challenged someone half my age, but I thrived on the complexity and constant learning. That evening, I had dinner with Margaret Walsh, the Deputy Secretary of Transportation, who had first invited me to serve on the National Aviation Advisory Committee. We had become friends over the months of working together on aviation policy. "Sophia," she said as we reviewed the wine list at an upscale restaurant overlooking Elliott Bay, "I have a proposition for you. The Secretary is creating a new position, Senior Advisor for Aviation Innovation. It would involve leading a task force to develop next-generation approaches to airline efficiency, customer service, and employee satisfaction. Interested?" The offer was intriguing, but I had learned to be strategic about new commitments. "Margaret, it sounds fascinating, but I'm curious about the time commitment. I'm in the middle of expanding Pacific Coast Airways into international routes." International routes? "Sophia, you're not slowing down at all, are you?" I smiled, remembering similar comments from my family. "Margaret, I spent years accepting other people's assumptions about what I should be doing at my age. Now, I make decisions based on what interests me and what I can contribute, not on what's considered age-appropriate." As I prepared for bed that night in my hotel room, looking out at the lights of Seattle reflected in the dark waters of Puget Sound, I felt a contentment that went beyond professional success. I had built something meaningful, proved something important, and inspired other people to reject limitations they had accepted about their own potential. My phone displayed 17 new emails, including inquiries from 3 more regional airlines, interested in joining the Pacific Coast Airways network. Tomorrow would bring another day of complex decisions, strategic planning, and leadership challenges that would have intimidated many people regardless of age. But I was no longer the woman who had been excluded from a family vacation because she was supposedly too old for adventure. I was Sophia Brown, Airline CEO, policy advisor, and living proof that the best chapters of life can begin at any age if you have the courage to reject other people's limitations and embrace your own possibilities. The Hawaiian vacation my family had planned without me had lasted 2 weeks. The life I had built in response to their exclusion was still expanding, still growing, still full of potential I was only beginning to explore. At 66, I wasn't slowing down. I was just getting started. 5 years after that fateful dinner where my children excluded me from their Hawaiian vacation, I found myself in the most unexpected place imaginable, sitting in the first-class cabin of Pacific Coast Airways Flight 892, bound for Maui, surrounded by my entire family for what had become our annual tradition. But this wasn't just any flight. This was the inaugural journey of our newest aircraft, a state-of-the-art Boeing 737 MAX that I had personally overseen from design to delivery. The plane bore a special elevation, the Sophia Brown, making it the flagship of our now 60 aircraft fleet. "Grandmother Sophia," said my 10-year-old granddaughter Chloe, Emily's youngest, "is it true that you bought this whole airplane company because we didn't invite you on vacation?" The directness of youth never failed to amuse me. "Well, Chloe, it's a bit more complicated than that, but yes, that's essentially how it started. My grandson, Jake, now 14 and infinitely more interested in business than he had been 5 years ago, leaned forward with genuine curiosity. But Grandma, didn't you already have enough money? Why did you want to run an airline?" Emily shot him a warning look, but I held up my hand. These were exactly the kinds of questions I encouraged. "Jake, money was never the point. The point was proving that being 71 years old doesn't mean you're finished contributing to the world. Sometimes the most important thing you can do is show people, including yourself, what's actually possible." As our flight took off from Phoenix, climbing smoothly into the desert sky, I marveled at how this simple family vacation had become a symbol of everything that had changed in our relationships. We weren't just traveling together. We were traveling on an airline I had built from near bankruptcy into the most respected regional carrier in North America. "Mom," Michael said, settling into the seat across from me, "I have some news I wanted to share with the family." Everyone turned their attention to him, and I noticed something that would have been impossible 5 years earlier. He was looking directly at me when he spoke, not around me or past me, but seeking my attention as an equal participant in family discussions. "I've decided to leave my law firm and start my own practice specializing in aviation law. I want to focus on helping smaller airlines navigate regulatory challenges and growth opportunities." Sarah nearly choked on her wine. "Michael, that's a huge risk. You're giving up partnership track at one of Denver's most prestigious firms." "For an opportunity to build something meaningful," he replied, his eyes still on me. "I've learned from Mom that the biggest risk isn't taking chances. It's accepting limitations that other people place on your possibilities." I felt a swell of pride that had nothing to do with the fact that his new practice would likely benefit from my industry. Connections. My son had learned to see opportunity where others saw risk, to value building something significant over accepting someone else's definition of success. The conversation continued throughout the flight, with family members sharing updates about their lives, careers, and dreams. But what struck me most was how differently they spoke to me now. Gone were the careful, patronizing tones of 5 years ago. In their place was genuine respect for my opinions, excitement about my achievements, and curiosity about my future plans. "So what's next for Pacific Coast Airways?" Sarah asked as we began our descent toward Maui. "Are you planning to retire soon and enjoy the fruits of your labor?" I laughed, the same laugh that had become my signature response to suggestions about slowing down. "Sarah, last month I signed agreements to acquire 3 airlines in Canada. Next year we're launching routes to Mexico and Central America. Pacific Coast Airways is becoming Pacific Coast International." "Mom," Emily said with a mixture of admiration and disbelief, "you're 71 years old and you're building an international airline empire. Don't you ever want to just relax?" "Emily, I spent decades relaxing. I spent years accommodating everyone else's schedules, stepping aside for other people's priorities, making myself smaller to fit into roles other people thought were appropriate for my age. This isn't work for me. This is the most energizing thing I've ever done." As we touched down in Maui, I looked out the window at the tropical paradise that had once represented my exclusion from family life. Now it represented something entirely different, the destination for a family that had learned to see each other, clearly without the distortion of assumptions about age, capability, or potential. That evening, as we sat on the beach watching the sunset paint the Pacific in brilliant colors, Chloe approached me with a serious expression. "Grandmother Sophia, when I grow up, I want to be like you." "What do you mean, sweetheart?" "I want to be the kind of person who doesn't let other people tell her what she's too old to do." I pulled her close, thinking about how different this conversation was from the one I might have had with my own grandmother at her age. "Chloe, the secret isn't waiting until you're older to start ignoring what other people think. The secret is starting right now to believe in your own possibilities." As the stars emerged over the Hawaiian sky, I reflected on the extraordinary journey that had begun with hurt feelings and evolved into a transformation I could never have imagined. The family vacation I had been excluded from had become an annual tradition that celebrated not just our relationships, but the reminder that it's never too late to rewrite the story of your life. The woman who had been deemed too old for adventure had created adventures that employed thousands and inspired millions. The mother who had been excluded from family planning had become the matriarch, whose achievements brought the family together in genuine celebration rather than obligatory duty. Tomorrow we would return to Phoenix on another Pacific Coast Airways flight. I would return to board meetings, acquisition negotiations, and the endless, exciting challenges of building something that mattered. But tonight, surrounded by family who finally saw me as I actually am, I was simply grateful for the unexpected gift that rejection had given me, the opportunity to discover what was possible when I stopped accepting other people's limitations and started embracing my own unlimited potential. At 71, I wasn't reflecting on a life well lived. I was planning the adventures still to come. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.